The first thing I noticed wasn't the water. It was the smell. Anybody who's spent enough years around would knows exactly what I'm talking about. That damp, sour smell that tells you something valuable is dying. I remember pulling into my driveway just after sunrise on a Tuesday morning, coffee in one hand, truck keys in the other, expecting nothing more exciting than another day in my workshop. Instead, before I even reached the door, that smell hit me. At first I thought maybe I'd left a window cracked during the storm that rolled through the night before. Maybe a little rain got in. No big deal. But the moment I unlocked the door and pushed it open, my stomach dropped straight through the floor. Water. Everywhere. Not a puddle. Not a leak. Water. Dark, muddy water covering the entire floor of my shop, almost up to my ankles. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. Then I stepped inside, and every step felt worse than the one before. My table saw was sitting in dirty brown water. My planer looked like it had spent a week at the bottom of a lake. Toolboxes floated against the walls. Cabinets I'd built with my father years ago were swollen and splitting apart. Lumber I'd been drying for months was ruined. Thousands of dollars gone overnight. But honestly, the money wasn't what hurt. What hurt was seeing pieces of my life floating around like trash. That shop wasn't some hobby room. It was where I built furniture, repaired things for neighbors, worked through bad days, celebrated good ones. It was the one place that always made sense when the rest of the world didn't. My wife, Karen, came out a few minutes later and just stopped in the doorway. She looked at the mess, looked at me, and quietly asked, "What happened?" I wish I had an answer. For most of that day, I assumed it was nature. Maybe the storm had been worse than I realized. Maybe a drainage pipe collapsed somewhere. Maybe I just got unlucky. But the more I looked around, the less any of that made sense. The roof was fine. The walls were fine. There wasn't a single broken pipe on my property. The water had come from somewhere else. By that afternoon, I grabbed a pair of boots and started following the trail. The ground behind my property sloped gently toward a wooded area, and that's where I found something that hadn't been there a month earlier. A ditch, freshly dug, not some natural runoff channel carved by rain. This thing had been engineered. The dirt was still loose. The edges were sharp, and every bit of water from the previous night's storm had flowed straight through that ditch and directly onto my land. I followed it farther uphill and eventually reached the edge of a development called Fairway Pines. If you've ever seen one of those upscale golf communities, you know the type. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, expensive golf carts. Residents who somehow find a way to complain about everything despite living in paradise. The ditch connected directly to their stormwater system. I remember standing there thinking, no way. No way somebody would intentionally redirect water onto private property. Even for an HOA, that seemed crazy. So I started making calls. County offices, planning departments, public records. One conversation led to another, and after a couple days of digging, both on the phone and in person, the truth started coming together. Fairway Pines had recently completed a drainage improvement project. Their golf course had been suffering from standing water after heavy rains. Golfers hated it. Residents complained. Property values were affected. So the HOA board approved a redesign that would move excess runoff away from the course as quickly as possible. The problem was where they moved it. They moved it onto me. I wish I could tell you there was some complicated engineering mistake involved, but there wasn't. Someone made a decision. Someone looked at a map, saw my land downhill, and decided my workshop was an acceptable sacrifice. The next morning I called the HOA president, a man named Preston Holloway. Preston had one of those voices that always sounded like he was explaining something to a child. I told him exactly what happened. I told him my shop was destroyed. I told him the drainage project was sending water directly onto my property. There was a long pause. Then he said, "Our engineers assure us everything complies with community regulations." I said, "Preston, I don't live in your community." Another pause. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. "Mr. Callahan, it's just stormwater. These things happen. Just stormwater." I looked out the window at 20 years of tools rusting in a flooded building and felt something inside me shift. Not anger yet. Something colder. The kind of feeling you get when you realize the person on the other end of the conversation doesn't see you as a person at all. To him, I was just a problem outside the gate. A guy with land. A guy without influence. A guy they expected to stay quiet. What Preston didn't know was that my family had owned that property long before Fairway Pines ever existed. Long before the golf course. Long before the clubhouse. And while I sat there replaying that conversation in my head, I remembered something my father had told me years ago about the pond sitting between our property and the golf course, a pond the HOA had been using for free for more than a decade. At the time, it seemed like a random memory, a useless detail. But before the week was over, it would become the most expensive oversight Fairway Pines ever made. The funny thing about getting older is that you start realizing most big battles aren't won by the strongest person in the room. They're won by the person who knows one little piece of information nobody else bothered to learn. After my conversation with Preston, I couldn't stop thinking about that pond. It sat behind a line of old willow trees near the eastern edge of my property, a quiet place where my father used to fish on summer evenings. When Fairway Pines was built almost 15 years earlier, the original developer had approached my dad about using water from the pond to irrigate the golf course. According to Dad, the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Two men standing beside a pickup truck, shaking hands because that's how people handled things back then. No lawyers. No contracts. No paperwork. Just trust. The problem was that trust only works when the people involved deserve it. Dad had passed away several years before, and most of the original developers were long gone. The people running Fairway Pines now weren't interested in relationships. They were interested in leverage. So I started digging. Every evening after dinner, I'd sit at the kitchen table with county maps spread across the surface while Karen watched me disappear deeper into property records. A couple nights later, she walked in carrying coffee, looked at the pile of documents, and asked, "Tell me you're planning something." I smiled and said, "Not yet." The truth was I didn't know what I was planning. I was just looking for answers. Then one answer led to another. The pond itself was mostly on my property, nearly 75% according to the surveys. More importantly, the pump station feeding the golf course irrigation system wasn't near the property line like everyone assumed. It sat completely inside my boundary. Not partially. Not technically. Completely. I checked the survey twice because I thought I must be missing something. Then I checked again. Same result. By midnight, I was sitting there staring at the maps, grinning like an idiot. Karen looked over from the couch and said, "That smile usually means somebody's about to have a bad week." I said, "I think Fairway Pines is about to have a very bad summer." The next morning, I drove to the county office and requested every easement, agreement, permit, and access document connected to that property. 3 hours later, I had confirmation. There wasn't a single legal document granting Fairway Pines access to the pond. No water rights agreement. No easement. No lease. Nothing. They had spent years acting like they owned something they had never legally secured. I remember sitting in my truck afterward just laughing. Not because I wanted revenge. Not yet. It was because of the sheer arrogance of it. They had lawyers for everything. Rules for everything. Fines for everything. Yet somehow nobody had bothered checking whether they actually had rights to the water keeping their precious golf course alive. That afternoon, I visited a local attorney named Rick Harmon. Rick had known my father for years and listened quietly while I explained everything. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked one question. "Do you want to hurt them, or do you want to teach them?" I thought about it for a moment. "I want them to fix what they did." Rick nodded. "Then make sure every step you take is legal, documented, and impossible to misunderstand." That's exactly what I did. The following Monday, before sunrise, I drove to the pump station carrying a heavy-duty steel lock. The building itself was small, just a concrete structure housing pumps and controls. I photographed everything. Property markers. Survey stakes. The building. Then I locked the door, took one final picture, and left. No drama. No confrontation. No threats. By lunchtime, nobody noticed. By the next day, people started asking questions. By the third day, panic was spreading through Fairway Pines. July temperatures climbed into the 90s and the irrigation system wasn't running. The emerald green fairways everyone bragged about began losing color. Brown patches appeared. Then larger brown patches. Golfers complained. Residents complained. Visitors complained. The superintendent of the course called emergency meetings. Somebody eventually discovered the pump station was inaccessible. Then somebody discovered why. My phone rang Thursday afternoon. "Preston, you locked our pump house." I said, "No, Preston. I locked my pump house." Silence. Then came the familiar condescending tone. You can't interfere with community infrastructure. I nearly laughed. Funny thing about that. Apparently your community infrastructure is sitting on my land. He hung up. The next day I received a cease and desist letter. The HOA demanded immediate restoration of water access. The language was aggressive. The threats were dramatic. It was clearly written by someone billing by the hour. Rick read it and smiled. Well, that's adorable. Together we prepared a response. Attached was a detailed invoice. Replacement costs for every damaged tool. Restoration costs for the workshop. Cleanup expenses. Lost materials. Professional assessments. Then we added something else. 10 years of unauthorized water usage fees based on commercial irrigation rates. The final number was large enough that even I stared at it twice. We mailed it certified. 3 days later Preston called again. This time he wasn't laughing. This invoice is absurd. I said, so was flooding my property. He argued. I listened. He threatened legal action. I wished him luck. Then I hung up. Over the next month the situation escalated. Fairway Pines refused to negotiate. They assumed I'd eventually fold. They assumed the pressure would break me. Instead, I continued documenting everything. Every conversation. Every letter. Every expense. Meanwhile the golf course kept deteriorating. Television commercials advertising beautiful greens suddenly looked ridiculous compared to reality. Residents started posting photos online. Prospective buyers visiting the community saw yellow grass and dusty fairways. Property values became a growing concern. Internal divisions appeared inside the HOA board. Some members wanted settlement. Others wanted a fight. Then came the drought. Not a severe drought, just enough dry weather to turn a bad situation into a disaster. Fairway Pines needed more water than ever, and they still had no legal access to it. That's when I made my next move. Years earlier, my father had maintained an elevated water level in the pond using a small control structure along the creek. It wasn't required. It simply made the pond larger and prettier. Since the golf course depended on that elevated level, I decided to return the pond to its natural condition. Again, everything was legal. Everything was documented. We notified the proper agencies. We followed every regulation. Then we opened the structure and allowed the pond to settle back to its historic creek level. The result was immediate. Water volume dropped dramatically. Suddenly, there wasn't enough reserve capacity for Fairway Pines to operate as before, even if they somehow regained access. They began trucking water onto the course. Massive tanker trucks rolled through the gates daily. Residents watched thousands of dollars disappear every week just to keep the grass alive. At community meetings, people demanded answers. One resident reportedly stood up and asked why the board had spent years enforcing mailbox color rules but never secured legal water rights. Nobody had a good answer. Another asked why they flooded a neighboring property instead of fixing the drainage properly. Again, no answer. By September, the pressure became unbearable. Golf memberships were being canceled. Refund requests were increasing. Homeowners were angry. Board members were turning against each other. One evening, I was working in the temporary shed where I'd moved my surviving tools when a black SUV pulled into my driveway. Preston stepped out. For the first time since this started, he looked tired. Not angry. Not arrogant. Tired. He walked over and stood there awkwardly for a moment before speaking. What will it take to make this go away? I set down the piece of cedar I was sanding and looked at him. Months earlier, he had spoken to me like I didn't matter. Now he was standing in my driveway asking for help. Funny how quickly power shifts when reality gets involved. I told him we could discuss terms. Real terms. Not demands. Not threats. Actual negotiations. Preston nodded. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said something I never expected to hear. We should have handled the flooding differently. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the closest thing I was going to get. And it was enough to start the conversation that would change everything. A week later, we were sitting around a conference table that felt a whole lot different from the conversations we'd been having over the phone. There were attorneys present, engineers present, board members present, and for the first time since my workshop flooded. Everybody seemed interested in facts instead of excuses. The negotiations lasted most of the day. Fairway Pines tried trimming numbers here and there, tried finding ways to reduce responsibility, but the reality was sitting in several binders stacked neatly in front of us. Photos, surveys, repair estimates, property records. Every document told the same story. Eventually, the arguing stopped because there wasn't much left to argue about. By the end of the afternoon, we reached an agreement. The HOA would pay for a complete reconstruction of my workshop from the ground up. Every damaged tool would be replaced. Cleanup costs would be covered. Additional compensation would be paid for materials, lost projects, and property damage. Most importantly, a formal 25-year lease would be established for access to the pond, with annual payments made in advance and strict conditions protecting my property rights. No handshake, no assumptions, no shortcuts, just signatures, obligations, and consequences. The construction crews arrived less than a month later. I'll admit, there was something deeply satisfying about watching contractors hired by the same HOA that flooded my shop, now working overtime to build me a better one. Day after day, the structure took shape. Stronger foundation, better drainage, new electrical systems, better insulation. By early spring, it was finished. The first morning I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I just stood there for a while. Fresh cedar lined part of the interior. Sunlight poured through clean windows. New equipment sat exactly where I wanted it. The smell of sawdust replaced the smell of mildew. For the first time in nearly a year, the place felt like home again. A few days later, I ran into Preston near the pond. We exchanged a polite nod. Neither of us had much left to say. The fight was over, at least officially, but every now and then I'd see him looking toward the pump station, and I couldn't help wondering if he was thinking about how close they came to losing far more than money. The golf course recovered. The grass turned green again. Golf carts rolled across the fairways. Visitors returned. From a distance, everything looked exactly the way it had before. That's the funny thing about communities like Fairway Pines. They work very hard to make sure everything looks perfect. What you don't see are the lessons buried underneath. The lesson that property rights matter. The lesson that arrogance can become very expensive. The lesson that treating neighbors like obstacles instead of people has consequences. Even today, whenever I walk into my workshop and catch that smell of fresh-cut wood, I remember the morning I opened the door and found everything underwater. Looking back, the flood wasn't really the turning point. The turning point was the moment I realized I didn't have to scream, threaten, or lose my temper to fight back. Sometimes the strongest response is simply understanding the rules better than the people trying to use them against you. And here's the part that always starts arguments whenever I tell this story. Some folks say I went too far. Others say I wasn't hard enough on them. Personally, I think Fairway Pines got exactly what it earned. They wanted dry fairways and easy solutions, so they pushed their problem onto someone else. In the end, they paid to fix every bit of damage and signed a contract they'll be honoring for decades. As for me, I got my workshop back, a better one than before, and a reminder that patience can be far more powerful than revenge. But I'd love to hear what you think. If your property had been flooded because a powerful HOA decided your land was expendable, would you have done the same thing, or would you have handled it differently? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about property rights, HOA conflicts, and ordinary people standing up for themselves, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for the next one, because sometimes the quietest neighbor on the street turns out to be the last person you should underestimate.